Hello?
Hmm.
Yeah. Hey, so Sam, what do you understand about globalisation?
Nothing.
Nothing.
I have no idea what it is.
Yeah. But how do you see people interpreting?
Well, there seems to be quite a bit of confusion right at the beginning of, I guess, globalization. To me, I was first introduced to it through I had heard about it, but fully introduced to it during S11,
Yeah.
the World Economic Forum protests, or just before that anyway. And at that time, one of the issues was how to discuss globalization or the anti-globalization movement without saying we're against, the globalization of people, like traveling or going across the planet or whatever. So it's how to actually critique corporate globalization instead of critiquing or being opposed to the globalization of cultures and peoples and
So there's positive aspects of globalization, negative side, and corporate globalization. What do you mean?
Okay, well, corporate globalization I'm still quite I haven't really decided fully what I actually think about that whole issue, but corporate globalization, from my understanding, is the deliberate collaboration between corporations to form global networks in order to more efficiently exploit the resources and the labors of the planet. They often do that through positioning themselves as a higher authority to government and overriding local decisions within states and enclosures, things like that. So that's what I understand by corporate globalization. It's basically the internationalization of the corporate machine in order to become more efficient. So McDonald's is a good example of a corporate globalization rollout, if you like, across the planet.
Yeah. And have you got any
But so is Yahoo, for that extent.
Yahoo?
Yeah, Yahoo or CNN or.
So the institutions can lobby at like federal government, state government,
Right.
Decisions.
The corporations.
Yeah.
Yeah, tied in. I think the main vehicle of corporate the strategies of the corporations lie at the hands of the public relations companies, and if anything, I think it is that group, the PR firms, that actually do the lobbying and the manipulation and the public opinioning, which enables the corporations to actually do what they do.
That's interesting. So it's more of a globalization is a propaganda game as well.
Yeah, you can actually say that it's maybe even pretty much symbolic. You still get that idea. I'm not too sure. You get the feeling that a lot of the corporations haven't actually distributed themselves around the world. They're still quite centralized, and they have arms or tentacles around the planet. Or they work through other organizations or other companies that are situated in different countries. So it's this kind of an illusion that that they create to say that they're actually everywhere. They have offices in 3,000 cities around the world, when really those offices might be a small room, but they're big offices in New York or wherever.
So you see globalization as a centralized thing as well, like centralized.
Well, corporate globalization potentially, yeah, I think so. I think it's basically the ability of a corporation to become more efficient in the way it carries out its business around the world.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. So what can your average punter in Fitzroy or Collingwood, what could they do to sort of combat changes that you see as quite negative?
Well, this is the thing. I don't know. I haven't I haven't really con- I haven't really thought about it too deeply to know whether or not everything about what's going on is negative.
Yeah.
I mean, there are obviously some aspects of it, like, for example, drugs and the availability of drugs.
Yeah.
I'm always seeing that happen now, where, you know, I guess the way corporations work is also not necessarily by providing their goods and their services everywhere, but also by denying their goods and services to certain places and focusing on markets which are more profitable.
Yeah.
So, you know, with especially HIV type drugs, you know, there's a big issue around Africa where it's too expensive to access there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, because in a way, what the corporations or what those drug companies are thinking is that, you know, we're going to actually not bow down, and we're going to wait until the rest of so-called civil society comes up with the money that's needed to pay to, you know, provide these drugs to the millions of people in Africa, for example. When, you know, they could very easily license a generic, you know, drug that does what the expensive drug currently does. But the average punter in Fitzroy, not much.
Yeah.
I think again, I'm in Australia, and Fitzroy and Melbourne, I mean, we're quite privileged. There's no real, you know, the sky is blue most of the time, and
Yeah.
the coffee flows out of many cafes on Brunswick Street. And I think there's a lot of distractions in Melbourne and there's really no reason for us to be too upset about it in the current way our lives are.
So
I'm generalizing massively.
yeah,
but,
yeah, I suppose.
Yeah.
When you deal with
Yeah.
large subjects.
Yeah.
So, but you see, in the Fitzroy and Melbourne, Australia as winners in the globalisation debate. Or
Yeah, I mean, I think you cannot go winners or losers. I mean, I think that whole north-south dichotomy thing is very problematic.
Yeah.
I think there's degrees. I mean, I think what would be very useful for the average person in Fitzroy to do is actually become more aware of the issues. But having said that, there is actually a lack of information available, which can actually, you know, enable someone to empower themselves with information.
And you mean a lack of information through traditional media sources or
Well,
newspapers?
Even, well, definitely that, but also just a lack of accurate information. It's very hard to know what's actually true and what's actually real, or what has integrity and what's just hype, what's fear-mongering.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the big things about, I guess, one of the things that globalization was being blamed for, and probably still is, was the reduction in wages of workers, and also the, you know, the sackings that have occurred in the recent past in Australia specifically, with large companies moving offshore. And I think those sort of issues have brought, you know, corporate globalization a bit more to the kind of, you know, the foreheads of some of the people here. But still, I mean, it's really hard to say the reason why those people have lost their jobs is because of the strategy by corporations to find, you know, areas where they can actually work and, you know, hire people for less money than they can in Australia. I guess you can say that. Yeah.
So, yeah. So but you don't see a link between, like, you know, large industries moving to cheap wage countries from Australia?
No, I do see a link, but I think that link is very hard to describe.
Yeah.
I think there isn't enough information out there to actually connect that. You can say, well, but so what? That's pretty. I mean, that's a normal. You know, that's actually, well, that's probably, you know, I think if I was in their position, I'd probably do the same thing in their business. So it's really hard to say that, well, there's actually something wrong with that, and the reasons why they are able to do that is because of X, Y, Z. And it's that X, Y, Z part that we don't have enough information about, I think.
So there's probably even examples of, you know, Collingwood and Fitzroy used to be big industrial areas not so long ago. So there's probably examples of that happening.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the big examples coming up is Starbucks. Coffee chain moving up into Lygon Street, and that's going to put a lot of, well, I mean, that's what the people campaigning against it are suggesting, is that it's going to put a lot of local traditional family-run coffee shops or cafes out of business. Whether that's true or not, is yet to be seen.
Yeah, and that brings homogeneity, the cultural homogeneity debate as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, that's another thing that globalization, I guess, is accused of doing, is monoculturing society. That everyone eats McDonald's and wears Nike shoes,
Yeah.
for example. But I think that also simplifies the issue quite a lot. I think it's more detailed than that. And again, I think we need to ask, why does everyone feel compelled to eat McDonald's and wear Nike shoes? And I think maybe that question isn't being asked enough. Is there some other issue going on within our own society to do with individuals and people?
But perhaps that's where the PR and the propaganda of the corporation.
Yeah, possibly. Possibly. The other option is that people are just going through a cycle of, wanting to kind of follow fashion magazines and believe in television and, just experience easiness, be told what to do.
Yeah.
I'm not too sure, maybe some sociologists could talk to you more about that. And, in 10 years' time we'll go, wow, can't believe we all did all that. And they might change. I think Fitzroy and Collingwood, maybe more, this area, there seems to be much more. You get the feeling that a lot of people who are around here are actually, they value their individualism quite a bit.
Yeah.
And
as opposed to the suburbs or other.
Yeah, possibly you can say as opposed to maybe, outer suburbs.
Yeah.
But that is also because but what comes with that is also a strong sense of arrogance and a lack of community, and a lack of different values kind of take over, I guess.
Yeah. So living in a local community like this, where do you get most of your information from? You said you were skeptical about the truth, getting reliable sources.
Yeah, this is a really big problem. I guess one of the areas that one of the areas that I get information from is other friends, people that I know who actually get information, and then I talk to them.
Yeah.
So we have like a network of information providers who are actually individuals who talk amongst themselves.
The word of mouth.
It's a word of mouth thing, so I think that's useful, and that way you actually get to you have a kind of a feedback mechanism where you can actually ask, so what does anti-globalization actually mean? And you might get a few responses, and you can formulate your own thing. You might get referenced to other information sources on the net, or.
Is there really an anti-globalization movement?
Well, this is the big question.
Just a catchword.
I think you could probably accurately say that there was the idea of an anti-globalization movement existed between Seattle and about now. And I think there was this idea that there was this thing called an anti-globalization movement, which other people have described as a movement of movements. But a general, basically a very kind of like an ad hoc group of people, numbering from a few hundred to a few 100,000, that would turn up to these international summits that were perceived to represent the process of corporate globalization. So if you can say that, then you can say that the people who turned up to protest against that was an anti-corporate globalization movement. Some would argue that that movement started a long time ago. Some would say that it hasn't finished yet.
Wanted more local economy.
Well,
more local democracies.
Well, who knows what they wanted. This is the thing that's really hard to. One of the problems that happened was, because some people say that because of the diversity of those groups, they actually couldn't they couldn't articulate what they wanted.
To a broader public.
Yeah, or even to themselves, to actually wanted in counter to what the corporate globalisation movement was saying. There wasn't a strong vision or a signal that came out which was practical and that could be understood by by the rest of so-called civil society, or whoever you want to call them, or even by the media. The answers, the responses they were saying just wasn't, it wasn't common sense. It was, you heard slogans like "we need to localize more" and general ideas like that, which were good. I mean, and that's all relevant.
So you periodise the World Trade Organization protest in Seattle in 1929, and now is there any reason?
Well, people say that it stopped probably with Genoa, which happened in July, and then the incident that happened on 9/11, when the two planes ran into the towers, have pretty much finalized that movement, that new tactics and new strategies are needed. One of the things that happened, which has sort of expired now again or shifted back or kind of disappeared, was that anti-globalization movement temporarily became a peace movement.
Okay.
But again, that's maybe, that was probably that movement looking for where to go and how to deal with the current situation.
And using its skills of media.
Yeah. In terms of information sources, there is, obviously, one of the things that came out of Seattle was this thing called Indie Media, which is, I guess, it's an international protest CNN, if you like, with very little resources, relatively, run by people who aren't necessarily trained in journalism, operating under the slogan of "everyone is a witness, everyone is a journalist." So one of the features of Indie Media is it allows anyone to actually publish their opinions online, and the networking of Indie Media, is such that it's actually quite a prominent network amongst kind of, I guess you could call it the civil disobedience, or the Western, or the Northern civil disobedience movement, or the European, the US, and the Australia. The Northern Western civil disobedience movement. They're all familiar with Indie Media, and they refer to Indie Media for quite a bit of their news, I think, quite often.
So, do you see the self-publishing model, the way that people can, every person can publish on the web? Do you see that one of the most democratic uses?
I think then it brings in one of the problems of Indie Media is the fact that everyone can publish.
So its greatest benefit is also its greatest problem.
Yeah, the danger about Indie Media is thinking of it as a reliable news source. It's a reliable, it's a functioning opinion source. That's all it is.
Yeah.
It has opinions on it, and it's really good for documenting protests in real time.
Yeah.
So it's a great medium for people, which allows people to express their opinions about certain issues.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be seen as, factual news necessarily.
Yeah.
So the open publishing, obviously cannot work if you're seeking factual news, because anyone can publish it.
Yeah.
So there's no checking that goes on.
Yeah.
Yep.
So in a way, it could just be propaganda that.
Yeah, you can say that it's
relative.
But one of the things that's happened with Indie Media is it has a right of reply on every story, and you'll find that there is a self-moderation that goes on.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably that accountability, those ideas of accountability are much more alive within, I guess, let's call it the civil disobedience movement, for what it's worth, than it is within, the corporate-driven kind of movement.
So if someone posts an article that's obviously not correct, then you can get 20 people to say, well, okay, this actually didn't happen.
That's right.
It didn't happen this way.
Yeah, so you get people, confronting other people who've posted stories with different viewpoints and opinions. So you get kind of like not an average, but a kind of a weird, a scattered opinions around a certain topic. And this definitely doesn't happen in corporate-driven media. If anything, you can say corporate-driven media has an agenda, whereas Indie Media, you can say generally doesn't have an agenda.
So, if the events in New York, if they somehow affected the progressive globalisation, do you think they affected the corporate globalisation as well?
Well, I mean, this is the area that you can't actually tell yet. I mean, you can tie in the corporate globalization movement with militarization.
Yeah.
That big word.
Yeah.
So they are one and the same. So if anything, I mean, you can also say that because the corporate globalization movement has become a martyr to a certain extent as well,
Yeah.
by the fact that it was, that was attacked primarily. Obviously, the Pentagon also was, and the White House potentially was going to be attacked.
Yeah.
But the Twin Towers represents, the corporate world. You can say it's symbolic, of the corporate world. So by attacking that and collapsing it,
Yeah.
it became a martyr, and it connected freedom, peace loving, and all of those other kind of nice fluffy words with the Twin Towers. And when in reality what went on in the Twin Towers was the exploitation of, you can again, I'm just being massively generalizing, you can say that a lot of the strategies that were coming out of the Twin Towers, out of businesses working in the Twin Towers, was strategies of making profit, maximizing one person's profit relative to someone else's. So it's going to be interesting what happens. I mean, the other thing that happened straight after it is that the corporate world did kind of gather around and began donating money and things like that to actually put on. It showed its human face, if you like.
Yeah.
It cried a little with the firefighters. But tied in with that is now the corporate world will work on. It's already begun to accelerate the production of drugs to combat diseases like anthrax. It's working very fast on developing surveillance technologies. It's working basically to counter freedom, if you like.
So do you think that it's just being used as an excuse to globalise, like the events in New York are being used as an excuse to push a certain style of globalisation?
It's not being used as an excuse deliberately. I mean, I think the way capitalism or corporate world works is through opportunism.
Yeah.
And often that opportunism isn't actually consciously, they're not consciously aware of it. It happens in the subconscious.
Yeah, I hear Norton antivirus is selling quite well.
Right. Okay. So there you go. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, obviously there will be some companies that do position themselves, and they're going to make a lot of money out of what happened. Already, a lot of the surveillance firms, their stock prices have skyrocketed. I mean, they've gone up, 10 times.
But by surveillance?
One of the topics I'm doing at the moment has to do with facial analysis. What facial analysis allows is it's an automated system that determines or claims to recognize people. So these facial analysis systems are at the moment being installed in airports around the world. There's probably 2 or 3 main companies that provide those systems at the moment. And those companies' stock prices have really gone through the roof. Since, from $3 to like $15 since what happened.
So there's another way that a corporation could hinder a local community, particularly Canberra, public safety.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to do is get beyond kind of the us and them thing, or just, I think one of the things that we need to do is look at motivations.
Yeah.
And basically it's this big game, and I mean, this guy, Alan Griffith, he described, he was talking about something else, but he talked kind of like the world as a big chess game, that, there's this big game going on and people are, it's like a multiplayer chess game. And I think one of the things that we need to do, I mean, if I want to call myself like a social activist, if you like, is to understand the motivation. Why does a company want to sell, why do they want to set up Starbucks cafes around the world?
It's not necessarily motivated by evil, as George.
No, it's not necessarily motivated by evil at all. I mean, it's simply, I think, motivated by ambition. It's motivated by, I don't know. I think it's not about the corporations looking at the society and going, okay, you are all people we can exploit, and therefore that's what we're going to do. Obviously, there are people within corporations with that mindset, but I think I think it's more about the business culture that has evolved in the last, maybe a few hundred years, about issues like progress, and the corporations believe that what they're doing as a whole is about progress. So those Starbucks cafes are about progress. It provides a nice environment where people can go safely and drink coffee and read newspapers.
That's what we've already got.
Yeah, as opposed to what we got, which is exactly the same thing. Yeah, that's right. So
you mentioned earlier on that you demarcated and set the different types of globalisation. You said there was one that you actually liked. That was multicultural.
Yeah.
People around.
Yeah, I mean, multiculturalism I find very problematic. It assumes that people of difference are somehow special and need to be treated specially.
Yeah.
And that's nice and fluffy coming from, I mean, that's multiculturalism. The idea of multiculturalism comes from the dominant society.
Yeah.
And that's just a disclaimer thing.
It's a food celebration.
Yeah.
Different types of food.
Yeah.
Smith Street.
That's right. But one of the interesting things that will potentially happen is that the so-called anti-globalization movement basically does a flip, or it changes its direction very quickly, probably in the next 6 to 12 months, and becomes a no-border movement, a movement that's opposed to borders that restrict the flow of people.
Yeah.
And already you're seeing signs of a growing kind of, campaign, I guess, against the restriction of people through, I guess campaigns against, campaigns supporting migration, campaigns supporting the free flow of people across borders.
And certainly that's a big debate in a country like Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge debate at the moment, and it is the primary debate that, an election is going to be won or lost over, it seems.
With no alternative.
With no alternative, yeah, that's right. But, I mean, in Europe, the situation is, much bigger than Australia. I mean, in terms of just every aspect. I mean, the number of refugees that, that Europe takes in as a whole is so huge. But, at the moment there's, I don't know, numbers, and people are saying, I think the UN figures are 30 million refugees around the world, and 20 more million are internally displaced peoples within their own country.
So why now? Why do you think that the refugee crisis has come?
I think it's been coming to a head in the last, maybe, I mean, some people will probably say that the collapse of the Berlin Wall was when the refugee crisis became, not crisis, but, the people became aware of refugees.
Yeah.
But, you can go back to Vietnam with the boat people, and this is where it becomes interesting, where you can say that mass media has actually assisted in highlighting kind of like the issue of, well, back in the 60s and 70s there was mass media, but maybe it wasn't that articulate in expressing the, the people coming across on boats.
Do you think that sort of media also global media may also, because it's so dominantly Western, particularly American, that it sort of acts as a marketing tool for Western lifestyle, which perhaps people in poorer countries couldn't see before?
Yeah, I mean, possibly, but I don't. I think people decide to live. I think people generally make an assumption before mass media that there's a magic place called the West, which will provide them with a better lifestyle.
Yeah.
And sure, you can say that, mass media or advertising has kind of, provided people with another way of looking the West in a glamorized way, and that's actually made people more eager to leave their own situation in search of a better life. But I think it's dangerous to give the mass media in that context too much significance. I think it's more useful to look at the fact that the situation where people are coming from are so, places like Iraq or Israel. I mean, they're not. There's massive problems there, and people want to leave that place. They haven't seen an ad on TV, or they haven't been watching Neighbours, and they go, wow, Australia's a nice place to live in, and it's really hot where I am in Iraq or wherever, and yeah, let's figure out how to smuggle ourselves to Australia. I don't think it works like that. I think it's basically, people leave their home because they have to. Most people don't want to leave their home.
So, no border world. What do you think would happen?
This is all being discussed now. I mean, that discourse is really just developing. I mean, one of the big issues for a place like Australia or activists in Australia is if we promote a no border world, then what happens to our campaigning to protect, if you like, the indigenous rights or the environment. Well, the environment isn't such an issue, but say the rights of indigenous people who want to actually speak for a part of the land that they come from, the sovereignty of their land. So that becomes an issue. So we can't, we have to come up with some sort of discourse that can actually, includes both of those viewpoints.
I suppose in a country like Australia, it's also particularly volatile because we're like the third largest nation on Earth to landmass in terms of population.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think Australia's got a lot of interesting issues to deal with in the coming years. I mean, the reason why Australia is saying that it doesn't have a large population is because it can't actually sustain a large population, and environmentally that's probably accurate at this point in time. But one of the counters to that is, okay, well, let's use our technology and our skills to make sustainability in environments which are currently unlivable. And whether that happens or not, we'll see in the future. I'm ranting. Okay, is that it? Okay, cool.
Thanks a lot.
That's it. Over and out. Goodbye. Whoa.